All right. Officially welcoming everybody to BRJA's September 2024 13th of the month event. A little bit of virtual housekeeping before we get started. We encourage you to keep your video on if you can. It allows us to establish sort of sense of community in the room and understanding who's here. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We do encourage you to participate either in the chat or to come off mute, ask questions, make comments during discussion and Q&A times. We have a tech person here tonight, excuse me, Rebecca. She's going to be helping out with all things, including any difficulties you may encounter. So please feel free to message her if you have some problems that she can help with. This is our content and recording advisory. I will go through it quickly. The history of racism in the United States is longstanding, historic, and violent. This history has been perpetuated on Black and non-Black people of color, and therefore any such examination can be challenging. So we provide a content warning at the beginning of events or workshops and encourage you to take care of yourself over the course of the workshop. And yeah, so if you need to take a break or whatever, please make sure that you are caring for yourself during the event. These events are recorded. We are recording now, and we post them to our YouTube channel. And so welcome. This event is titled In or Out, Fannie Lou Hamer, Racial Justice and Electoral Politics 60 Years Later. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator tonight, Adar.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I am so excited. As we all know, we have an election coming up. But also, we know that democratic participation expands beyond just voting every 4 years or every 2 years. And so the question, are you in or out, doesn't just refer to voting, it refers to your participation in the democratic process. And here to explore those issues with us are two of my favorite people on all things politics, Ellis of the Baltimore City Green Party. Thank you so much for joining us again, Andy. And Nnamdi Lumumba of the Ujima People's Progress Party. Nnamdi, welcome again. This is a series that you all have been kind enough to join us and share your viewpoints, your expertise in education. And so glad to have you here again as we continue the conversation about Fannie Lou Hamer. A lot of people are not really aware of any parties other than Democrat and Republicans. And we know that there is a history of third parties in the United States that expand that. You two are representatives of two of them. So I would love it if you could just share a little bit more information, Andy, about the Baltimore City Green Party and Nnamdi about the Ujima People's Progress Party. Andy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the Baltimore City Green Party is a chapter of the Maryland Green Party, and the Maryland Green Party is one of the state parties that makes up the Green Party of the United States. I think it is, I want to go through a couple of things about the Green Party of the United States here to set the table so that we can understand, you know, with the perspective that we're coming from. It first started in 1984 as a collection of movement, community, and faith leaders. We started running state and local candidates as early as 1985 and started winning state and local races for elected Greens as early as 1985. Through the 1990s, state Green Party started to secure ballot access across the nation, mostly in the West, some in the upper Midwest, some in the Northeast. By the 2000 election, Ralph Nader and Winona, or in 1996, for the first time, Greens ran for president, and they have done so since then. In the 2000 election, Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke were on the ballot in 43 different states. And Ralph, in 2000, we talk a lot about what happened in Florida and the spoiler effect, but I think it's important to talk about the platform that Ralph ran on in 2000. He ran on reparations, campaign finance reform, environmental justice, workers' rights, women's rights, criminal justice reform, and an end to the corporate war economy. In 2001, the Green Party of the United States, as we know it today, was formed. Since 1985, 6,935 Greens have run for public office. The vast majority of them were not running for president. They were running for state and local office. Of those 1,500, over 1,500 Greens have won office since 1985. And again, the vast majority are at the state and local level. 137 races have been run in Maryland since 2000, and we have 3 candidates this year running outside of the presidential race. Renaud Brown, who I believe is on the call, is running in Baltimore City in the 14th Council District. Claudia Barber is running for a judge in Arundel County, and Nancy Wallace is running for a congressional seat in Montgomery County. And this year, Jill Stein and Butch Ware are running for president and vice president. They're on the ballot in 37 states. They're eligible to win 421 electoral votes. 2 of those states, Georgia and Nevada, are in court right now. Those make up 22 electoral votes, and there are 7 write-ins where Jill and Butch will be official write-ins that account for 74 electoral votes. So, that is the Green Party, the introduction to the Green Party. I'm sure we'll get more into values, details, campaign strategy, all that stuff, but that is a brief introduction and is
Thank you. That is
few bullets
wonderful,
that I could make it.
comprehensive information. Nnamdi?
Thank you. Well, the Ujima People's Progress Party is a Maryland-based party primarily. We were formed in 2010 as the state's first Black workers-led electoral political party. Its formation was rooted in the desire to address issues disproportionately affecting the Black working class communities in Maryland, such as economic inequality, housing, education, and criminal justice. Its focuses on anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, economic justice, democratic rights, and radical labor unionism, with an emphasis on self-determination for Black and other oppressed communities. We also are working nationally to build a radical Black political action committees all around the country, and also a coalition to build a national labor party, which would be rooted in unions as well as communities of color. Lastly, UPP bases its non-electoral campaign work and grassroots working class issues such as community control of police, affordable housing, economic justice and workers' rights, healthcare and environmental justice, and political education. So we see the political spectrum not just around the voting time, but what happens day to day in every city and every town.
Thank you. And that kind of takes us to the in or out, that voting is not just something that you do for every 4 years or every 2 years and then drop it. It is something that that democratic participation is something that goes on every day. One thing that I notice about both these parties is the emphasis on grassroots and the emphasis on organizing and work that happens between the voting cycles. So I'm really interested and hope that you all can talk a little bit about the difference of emphasis of those things with what the 2 established parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, focuses on, because in the time that leads up to the elections, we see a lot of emphasis on grassroots to pull out the vote. But during the low periods, if you will, we don't necessarily see that emphasis in the same way that we see the continued emphasis of grassroots organizing in the Green Party or the Ujima Party. So can you just, either one of you, both of you, just give a little tutorial in terms of how we got to Democratic and Republican parties today?
You want to take that one, Nnamdi, or you want me to take it?
Yeah, I'll fill in the blanks. I mean, obviously there's a bigger history, so go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, originally, in Washington's conception, there were no parties, but that quickly went by the wayside, and parties were very quickly formed in U.S. history. Very quickly, there were two dominant parties that had formed, and oftentimes they divided around questions of justice, questions of slavery, questions of economics. By 1844, there was a third party called the Liberty Party, and the Liberty Party had been around in previous elections, but in 1844, the Liberty Party ran a candidate named Bernie as the president, and he ran on an abolition platform. The Democrats and the Whigs at the time were both running on pro-slavery platforms and refused to budge on this question. The Whigs envisioned themselves the lesser evil of those two parties because they still believed in maintaining slavery, but they didn't believe in expanding slavery. And so in the election of 1844, in the election of 1844, the Liberty Party ran on an abolition platform, and they probably spoiled the election. They probably elected the Democrat, who was the worst of two evils in most people's mind at that time. And they did so because of the issue of slavery. And they ran on a staunch abolitionist platform. And in the 1844 election, New York was a swing state at the time, and free Black folks and white abolitionists made up the difference, knowing full well that their candidate was unlikely to win. They made up the difference in the election and tilted the election to Polk, who was the Democrat at the time. He launched an invasion of Mexico. He expanded slavery pretty aggressively. Now, the Whigs had an opportunity all through the election season of 1844 to, take a position against slavery. And if they had taken a position against slavery, they likely would have won that election and been able to begin the process of abolition earlier. They refused to do that, and by 1860, the Whigs disappeared as the Republican Party, a third party at the time that was avowedly anti-slavery, managed to galvanize support around that issue. Lincoln was elected. Lincoln was elected as a third party candidate at that time, and it led to the end of the Whig Party. After the Civil War, the Republican Party became the party of Reconstruction, the party of emancipation. The Democratic Party became the party of secession and enslavement. Those two parties sort of codified at that point and became the two dominant parties that existed on most ballots. But it's important to know that in almost every election since 1840, there have been most voters have had more than two choices in almost every presidential election, because small parties and auxiliary or satellite parties within the two dominant parties have been a feature of American politics from the beginning. And oftentimes those parties have organized around issues of democratic inclusion, racial justice, and economic justice. And those have been animating forces at most points for those parties. And, we get to today where there are two dominant corporate parties that have taken on the shape of corporations that market voting and donating as the way to engage in political participation. And they have stopped being about mobilization. They have stopped being about community grassroots building. They've stopped building about associational politics and have really become nationalized corporations focused on presidential and congressional elections who allow people to participate in two ways: donating and voting. So that is the history of two-party systems and multi-party systems as quickly as I can do it. Nnamdi, I'm sure you got some stuff to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, especially the nature of why you see organizations like ours be more grassroots as opposed to the two larger parties. There, again, in that history span, you had also a history of political organization, political clubs that were very strong. throughout the Democrat and Republican parties. Some lasted much longer. You can think about Bull Connor. You can think about the kind of political organizations that existed in Chicago, Baltimore, where these were real local machines that could guarantee turnout, could guarantee positions, could guarantee access. Those things have over the years gone away. And in the lieu of that, even though it still functioned as facilitators for national interest, right, of capitalism, they had a very local base of control and influence. So all the grassroots work was through usually through those instruments, right? People might be on the fringes of those things, and those things are completely gone. And so now political parties such as ours are trying to regain that political space. The truth is that there has never not been activism, right? But those activists tend to not be very well organized, especially the kind of organizational structure that political parties give you, the kind of carryover in knowledge, right, in training, resources, whether they be material or human. Those things have gone away, and now that's where the space we find ourselves especially strong in locally and regionally, because again, the major parties has, as Andy said, gone completely national and corporate, and they only let you play when there's elections.
Thank you. I want to explore that a little bit more, but there's something that you all were saying that I hope we can delve into. Andy, you talked about the Democratic Party being the party of enslavement and the Republican Party being the party of the abolitionists and freedom and blah, blah, blah. Those things, it seems like that is completely changed when you look at the racial demographics of both parties. And I'm wondering, what was it that sparked that change? Because even in political discourse, we hear one party saying, we're the party of Lincoln, we're the party of all of these things. But then when you look at the racial demographics, it's majority white. And then, you know, they're also saying the Democratic Party is not the party of Lincoln. The Democratic Party blocked this, this, and this, but the demographics and the policies don't necessarily match that history. Where and how did things change? And why did that go over everybody's head?
You want to start this one, Nnamdi?
Yes, so you had essentially you had two major historical moments, and the truth is they all circled around the democratic rights of Black people, civil rights of Black people in this country. So as we know, the Republican Party built itself obviously as at one time the liberal party in this country, the party of Lincoln, the party of anti-slavery. It still was the party of colonialism. It was still the party of capitalism. It was still the party of war, but we let those things go by when we talk domestically, right? So you had the buildup of the Republican Party. You had the largest number of Black elected officials at federal levels, governors, senators, congressmen, and a great amount of influence, right, coming out of Republican Party from the Black community. This was making it harder for the national Republican Party to win white people into the Republican Party, especially as we get further down to after the Reconstruction period. You start seeing more plans in motion about how to defranchise, right, Black men, particularly because Black women could not vote at that time, to how to defranchise them so that they would not have any influence. And so it was a series of laws. It was actually called the Lily White Movement. I believe it was out of Texas. There was a Black man who was the state Republican chairperson who recognized this, was trying to fight this, called it what it was. But over time, eventually, even the national Republican Party became a part of this because they recognized that if they were going to win the national elections, they had to be able to attract white men into their party. And that began the first exodus, right? Not even exodus. It wasn't like Black people chose to leave, they were pushed out. And then of course, you have the second question that comes around again as the second Reconstruction began in the United States, right? The Civil Rights Movement. You start to see this opportunity for the Democratic Party to, again, win national elections, right? Because when we think about the Democratic Party, even in the 60s, no one thinks about Alabama and Mississippi and those areas, because those are areas controlled by the Democrats, right? We have history of Malcolm X calling them what? Dixiecrats, right? So we have proof that it wasn't like the Democratic Party was the place of safe haven. It was a moment of opportunism that they saw an opportunity to be able to get Black votes, to be able to consolidate their bases in places they had been weak in for years. We talk about Fannie Lou Hamer today, who had to fight the Democratic Party just to be seated. So you have like a real history of how these things shift and change, and only because of recent history and lack of political education, to be quite honest. People don't even understand the origins of the political parties they join, right? So there's no real reference for why am I now a Democrat? Will Democrat Party ever become a right-wing party, which we see evidence of right now? So people have to be able to know that things aren't permanent, that these interests change, and people should be aware of how those interests change.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
okay, so since we're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, like let's talk a little bit about Mississippi as one of the examples here of how this transition occurred. So coming out of the Civil War in 1869, Mississippi adopted a new constitution that gave Black citizens the ability to vote. By 1870, because of that, Mississippi was readmitted to the Union. In 1871, 38 Black Republicans were elected to the state legislature in Mississippi, and Republicans controlled the state legislature in Mississippi. By 1875, white and Democratic terror tactics drove almost all of those Republicans out of office. And then once the white Democratic Party again had the control of the Mississippi legislature, they began to enact laws which stripped Black people of all of their voting rights that had been established during Reconstruction. 1876, we know there's a compromise. Rutherford B. Hayes gets elected by removing, he agrees to remove federal troops from the South, and any check that Black Republicans had on their political power started to erode at that point. By 1890, the Mississippi Constitution had been amended to have a literacy test, a poll test, a civics test, and a grandfather clause, so that there was literally no place where Black folks were able to participate for the most part by 1890. By 1902, the Mississippi Democrats had passed a primary election law which granted parties the ability to arbitrarily exclude people from the primary. And in 1903, the Democratic Party took advantage of that and only limited primaries in Mississippi to white voters. So, we get this set up there. And what is happening then at the time is that you get these factions within the Republican Party that are competing. You have the sort of black and tan Republicans who are the Black folks who had tried to maintain power within the Republican Party, and then the various white factions within the Republican Party that were trying to make there be some multi-party competition in the South by driving Black folks out of the Republican Party. Now, because the Democratic Party did not allow Black folks to vote in the primary, there was nowhere for them to go. But ultimately, what that competition between white Republicans and Black Republicans caused was a one-party state in most of the South. Almost the entirety of the South was controlled by Democrats, from the 1870s to the 1960s, and so you see sort of the emergence of you see the emergence of these factions within the Republican Party that are trying to redeem the Republican Party for white folks, and they're pushing Democrats out, and there's nowhere for them to go. So in 1944, the Supreme Court in 1944, the Supreme Court struck down the ability of parties to discriminate based on race and primaries. And so you start to then, at that point, see Black folks looking at the Democratic Party as a home for them in the South. And in 1944, the South Carolina Progressive Democratic Party forms, and we can talk more about that later, but it is a good understanding of Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964, because it formed within the Democratic Party as a parallel organization that was seeking its own candidates and seeking its own ability to run campaigns and candidates in there. So we'll put a pin in that for a moment because that's a lot of history. But South Carolina Progressive Democratic Party, I think, is a really important thing to talk about as a predecessor to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and to help us understand how that transition started to occur in Southern politics from the 1870s to the 1940s.
Thank you. I want to come back to that, but I see that there are two comments in the chat, and so I want to get to that. To give people who commented an opportunity to expand if they wanted to, and then just to get your responses, Andy and Nnamdi. So Politics is talking about neither Democrats nor Whigs would eliminate slavery. The great evil was ended by the Republicans as a third party, which Andy, you talked about a little, and now also making the case to move to an alternative party, the Green Party, since both Republicans and Democrats will continue to support genocide and ecocide. Thought?
Hey,
Yeah, so
I hate to take over it all, and you guys are great. I just wanted to give a shout out to the Greens because I'm so frustrated with what I'm seeing in the Democratic Party. I don't want it. I saw the response to what I said. I just want to reply to that briefly. I wasn't saying, when I said the great evil was ended, I only meant slavery. I didn't mean racism. I didn't mean exploitation of workers, which slavery can be viewed as a terrible, the worst form of exploitation of workers, where they're paid nothing whatsoever. So all of that continued after the fact, and the Republican Party proved incapable of addressing those subsequent or continuing evils. I'm saying now the Democratic Party has done in the past. We can point to positives such as the New Deal and the civil rights, and it was a bit of a different Democratic Party as well. But I don't view now either of the two parties capable of addressing. In fact, they support, as I see it, they support the genocide in Palestine. They support, the Democrats do, as well as Republicans, the ecocide that we're seeing our one earth, our one mother being destroyed. So that's why I'm saying we need to look to the Green Party.
Thank you. And who is, I'm sorry, BK?
Hi, how you doing, everybody? My name's Brandon.
Hi,
that's
Brandon.
actually my email. How are you? So I guess for me, I'm working back from the former, from saying the gentleman's method of slavery, understanding that when slavery was emancipated to quote abolished or quote unquote emancipated, there was the idea that, okay, well, there's no one to work the mills, there's no one to tour the fields, there's no one to pick the cotton, there's no one to go out and preserve the remnants of how money and capital was sustained inside of a system of a dual power structure. So the result of unions coming in place and also having white-led unions and sharecropping was the introduction and the idea of transcending from slavery into capitalism, which both parties are necessarily the poster child, if not the cornerstones, of what makes American class systems of race, sex, and incomes the determinant on whether or not you live this way or you die that way. Can you afford to milk it this far, or do you have to re-educate and reorient yourself out of it? And I'm looking at that in the frameworking, just walking back from my initial statement from former to latter to former, is to be able to say that Americanism itself is the sponsor of how we got a Democrat and Republican Party, that if you don't like racism, sexism, or imperialism on where your bonds and taxes go, then voting for those two parties are inherently the idea. And just bringing it to a close, That it's not necessarily to say that the alternatives are just the answer or the conclusion. It's an idea to say that if you believe in something, you will support it, you will organize around it, you will put your tax dollars, you will put yourself in the grassroots efforts to be able to change the history or the foundation which it was brought to.
Thank you. Can I expand on that a little, Brandon? Because you made me think about this, and Andy, this also gets back to something that you and Nnamdi were talking about in terms of both the Republican and the Democratic Party being nationalized corporations. And so they're nationalized corporations, both sharing the same underlying philosophy, which is what Brandon is getting at, right? It's just a matter of degree. In terms of whether people are just like out there implementing it, or whether they are implementing it with the hand in a velvet glove. But in terms of the capacity for transformative change in getting out of this American idea of white supremacy, and all that brings, neither party really has that as a focus. Which is why, regardless of who is in office, things stay the way that they are. And it gets, again, back to what you both were saying at the beginning of our discussion, when we were just talking about like this donor, class, the money that it takes for people even to mount a campaign. It just feels like people are already bought. And they're already sold by the time they get into office. And final point, when they get into office, they're taking an oath to uphold this racist, white supremacist, classist, imperialistic, et cetera, machine that is the United States of America. So what are we really doing when we are saying Democrat or Republican? Is there a real difference, or do these classifications just give us the illusion of difference?
Go ahead, Nnamdi.
Well, I'm glad you actually used the word illusion. I think the history of the Black community is a very important history for all of America when it comes to politics, right, and democratic rights. It was once posed to me when I was younger, if slave owners were really smart in America, they could have proposed a system in which slaves could have picked their new slave masters every 4 years and called that democracy, right? Because what it would have done is allowed enslaved people to be democratically able to pick who their oppressor was, and that would have been democracy, as an example. I think the other example that's really, really important, more important, is that our community is a community that, even though we're talking about the duopoly, had to exist in a political world without access to those political parties, but still have the impact of being able to force Reconstruction, having the impact of being able to force civil rights and all the rights that happened before the civil rights and afterwards. How do you explain to people who are now locked into the duopoly, who are locked into voting as the only expression of political action, right? When there's a whole culture and a whole history of resistance and political engagement that had nothing to do with the Democrat or Republican Party participation, but what you could do as an organized group of people to force those parties to make concessions. And that is a forgotten element, right? And I think that clearly is what we are struggling for, and taking the duopoly out of the center of the discussion, right? Because the truth is, people feel stuck. You're almost, how many times do you read people say, I'm going to vote for so-and-so, but I'm going to hold my nose? You cannot continuously demoralize people and expect them to want to participate in this process. And again, we can go into it. The numbers are showing you people are opting out of the Democrat and Republican parties. People are opting out of primaries, and the turnout for general elections aren't very high as well. So I mean, people just have to recognize that this equation does not equal democracy in this country.
Thank you. And if I can point out, that independents are left out. That if you are an independent in a lot of places, you can't even vote, in a Democratic or Republican primary. It's like you are just locked out of the process. Whereas being an independent doesn't mean that you don't want to vote. It means that you don't have an allegiance to any particular party and you are open to the policies, right? But yet you get left out until the very end. So what is that if not just a suppression of democracy for millions and millions of people? And Nnamdi, what you're saying about this thing about just this transcending voting, you're making me think of movements like the Montgomery bus boycott. There have been so many citizen-led movements which have changed the shape of policy platforms, of the juice that every politician has to create change because they know that they have the support of the people behind it. Do you all see those types of efforts that are grassroots community driven going on today with the same power and the same numbers that those types of movements had back then?
So let me take this, because I think the reason that it's really important to understand the reason that we have two parties like we have right now is because from the Reconstruction era until the post-World War II era, there were multiple parties in the US quite frequently. There were multiple parties at the national level, there were multiple parties at the regional and at the local level. Those parties tended to organize around economic justice, racial justice. Coming out of World War II, those parties were, the American Political Science Association created what they called responsible two-party governance. And they pushed a theory that said that if we have just two parties that are non-ideological and they can represent people, that they will responsibly negotiate compromises that allow growth and tamp down the threat from socialists, from Black radicals, from Black internationalists, and things like that. So you have this history of Black folks and of poor folks seeing that the system as it was designed coming out of Reconstruction wasn't serving them, building alternative political formations. And then you go into World War II, and coming out of World War II, when we wanted we wanted capitalism to succeed, we wanted to vanquish socialism, we wanted to vanquish Black internationalism, the American Political Science Association, academics, politicians, and judges come together to create responsible two-party governance. And responsible two-party governance has set the stage for where we are today, so that the forced choice that almost everybody has is a lesser evil choice. That lesser evil choice existed in South Carolina and Mississippi between 1870 and 1960. And when folks were able to take it, they often were in the same situation that you were talking about, Adar. Black folks were excluded from the primaries until 1944. So if they had the right to vote, all they were doing was choosing which of the two parties lesser evil candidates they were going to vote for. But because it was the South, the decision has already been made. The Democrats were going to win. And so there was no reason for Black folks to register to vote because it was meaningless participation for them unless they had their own political formations. Come through World War II, and you start seeing the Democratic Party start to try to divide Black radical formations from Black assimilationist formations. And they start to say that there's going to be a pathway into national democratic politics for Black assimilationist organizations. And there's going to be like jail and McCarthyism for Black radical organizations. And so you have a Black scare, Red scare mentality that's going on at that point that makes it impossible for Black internationalists to organize new political affiliations, and the assimilationist organizations are at that point being given legitimacy by the Democratic Party. So that all says to situate where we are at this point. And I think that what happens right now is that grassroots organizing political outcome is to join the Democratic Party in a lot of cases. And so you look at what happened with Black Lives Matter, and there's a book that I recommend in the resources here that talks about the way that the Black Lives Matter movement was independent, it was radical, and it was making a series of demands for justice beyond simply that had police as a touchstone, but were not solely related to police. And they were confrontational with the Democratic Party during the Obama years. They were confrontational with the Democratic Party up until George Floyd, and then they were effectively co-opted to be organs of the Democratic Party after that. So the radical energy that existed there was funneled into the Democratic Party. Maybe that's okay. I mean, some of that is okay. It has led to good, that's the process, right? Like movements at this point get co-opted into the Democratic Party and they make some meaningful changes and things like that. And there's some value in that. But that two-party system alone is not good enough in order to be able to ensure that that value is delivered, because they will do what they always do, which is force folks to compromise against the greater, what they call the greater evil, in order to elect one of the two nationalized presidential candidates. And so, you know, like, I don't have a problem with progressive activists going into the Democratic Party. I have a problem with the Democratic Party being the only outlet for grassroots organizers to go into if they want to engage in political action, or it being framed that way.
Mm.
So.
Okay, so this for me brings up the quote about who wants to assimilate into a burning house. And we can apply that to the political parties too. But Brother Moses, I see you like shaking your head and know you have something to say. What's up, sir?
I got my wake up call in regard to this political stuff. I was already kind of a pariah in certain circles. I was the loudmouth preacher who would call people to the carpet because they weren't looking after the gay children they should have. That being said, when I finally kind of got on the inside and I was a delegate for the Hillary Clinton campaign, it was like I literally saw the wizard behind the curtain and I was dismayed.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was there to represent a constituency that is often silenced and unheard. That being said, they had their own agenda the whole time. I was at the meeting after the meeting. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was already planned out. And so, to Angie's point, I think that we really need to have a thriving multi-party system, because what we got right now ain't it. And I decided to become an independent because I felt disgusted by what was going on in Gaza. It was disgusting to me. And it was also disgusting to me that a lot of these preachers and teachers out here didn't recognize the fact that Palestinian Christian lives are also at stake and they are conveniently ignored. And many of us have also been bought off by elements in either party around that issue. That's why we can't get anything done. And it's disgusting that it's come to this point. That's why we need multiple parties so that people can have an actual political home and not Burger King versus McDonald's. I'm over that.
Mm. Thank you. Nnamdi, I see you reacting and just want to come back to you again. Your thoughts.
Well, again, the duopoly is a very powerful entity, right? It centers the way we even talk about politics, and rightfully so. But at the same time, it is problematic that we can't come up with sustainable solutions that are outside of the Democratic and Republican Party models, right? And that's where it gets to be problematic. So you can say, for instance, we know in Maryland, if you have a problem with how education is funded, or police departments are funded, or the development plans are made, the boogeyman is not Donald Trump, right? The boogeyman is a Democrat who's probably Black or a woman who you probably went to the same high school with and run into at the chicken spot, whatever it is, who is behind all of these plans. And so how do you, as a movement, and the truth is, we know that there are activists who are constantly engaging these political people, right? These decisions, these programs, but it does not translate into like plan movement outside of the Democratic Party, right? And the Democratic Party's ability to capture those radical type of movements, those progressive movements, then also absorbs all of that energy, all of the expertise, all the resources, all the knowledge that those people gained, right? And so that goes to waste. And I think, again, for us, looking at history and then asking ourselves, how do we move forward? I think definitely for Ujima, it's about creating an institution that develops that kind of resistance, but understanding that, okay, you'll have a fight, you may win, you may lose a campaign, but you should not lose all the contacts, all the experience, all the institution, but all of that should not be given back to the same political entities, right, who are constantly attacking the rights of Black, brown, and working class people throughout this city and throughout this state. We should be able to control those resources. And when election time comes, let's put those resources back into motion, right? Because we also have to have political institutions to organize, to train. People talk about, where are the great candidates? Well, if anybody's running a campaign, where's the campaign managers? Where are the outreach coordinators? Where's the treasurers? Because you have to be able to create those people too to run good campaign. And they even have to be that much better, because if your budgets are going to be smaller, you're going to have to be that more efficient. And if you keep resetting and losing all that knowledge, it makes it harder and harder for you to succeed on the electoral side for all the gains and fights that you've made and the democratic rights struggles in between. So I think it's important that we're hearing this, but institutionalize it and critiquing the duopoly is important, because people are opting out. They're just not opting in to better solutions yet.
And that point that Nnamdi makes, like, that is, we can see that happening throughout history. So in 1944, the South Carolina Progressive Democratic Party formed. They went to the nominating convention of the Democratic Party, and they made a seating challenge based on the exclusion of Black delegates in 1944, similar to Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964, except they did it all with Black folks. Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had the support of white progressive organizations, white civil rights organizations, and things like that. But in 1944, the South Carolina Progressive Democratic Party went to the convention, made a convention challenge, made a credentials challenge, and demanded that the Black delegates be seated. They, of course, were not seated. And they started to run folks for office. And in 1946, Thurgood Marshall and a couple of other national Black figures went to them and convinced them to stop being a separate entity and instead to fold back into the actual Democratic Party in South Carolina and to take over that Democratic Party. And the reason they cited was you're not going to be able to get the resources and you're not going to be able to get the talented people in order to be able to defeat those folks. And so you see that happening. And then if you look at what happened with Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964, that convention challenge and their unwillingness to take the deal that was offered to them, to take the 2 seats deal, caused splits with the NAACP, it caused splits with CORE, it caused splits with some of the other civil rights organizations. So as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party tried to pursue, they too were forced with the national establishment that was telling them that you're going to lose your resources, you're going to lose your people, and you're going to lose your access to be able to do this stuff. And so I think that we can see that happening in 1944, 1964, and 2024, where the most talented people are offered big contracts. They're offered really comfortable lives. Like, people will say, why do these working class folks in the squad not join the Green Party or something like that? Well, they're not going to do that because they're guaranteed six-figure incomes for the rest of their life as long as they stay within the Democratic establishment. Bowman may have lost his election, or Bush may have lost her election, but they're going to be able to make do within the Democratic nonprofit industrial complex, within the advocacy complex, and they are working class people who are guaranteed an opportunity to make six figures for the rest of their life, or deal in poverty and political isolation. And so in a world where we have those type of institutions leveraging people's livelihoods, people's access to political power and things like that, it's inevitable that a lot of those people get picked off. And we've got to be able to build the institutions that make people stick around and that can control their own resources and are not dependent on a nonprofit or philanthropic industrial complex, are not dependent on big dollar donors, but are dependent on working people who are willing to build associational politics like existed for Black folks and working class white folks 100 years ago. And if we can't do that, there's no way out of this system.
Now, that's a word. So I want to make a couple of observations, and then I want to hear from Lawrence, who I know has something to say. He studies these issues and is always a source of knowledge for me, in addition to Andy and now Nnamdi. I want to hear from MJW. I want to hear from Erica. I want to hear from Elizabeth. And then I invite those who have already spoken also to chime in after we've heard from the people who have not spoken. But here are my observations from what you all have been discussing. The resource scarcity and lack of independent institutions, those are control measures. Those are control measures, right? Because the resource scarcity keeps people locked into a system in which they're holding their nose. The lack of resource scarcity means that we do not have what is needed to provide that training that Nnamdi talked about. And when I say training, I'm not just talking about the trainings on the mechanics of politics, but I'm talking about trainings on developing an analysis that recognizes the isms of how we got here and how this two-party and where this two-party system keeps us. Andy, you talked about the difference between people who are basically, are going to operate out of self-interest, as we all do, and stay in those six-figure jobs. Because if you don't have an analysis or you don't know exactly how we got here, then where is the imagination or even the realization that there can be something different? There is no more than just what is in front of our face now and how we can take care of the material needs of our families, as opposed to movement building and understanding that the two-party system isn't everything or the only thing. We can have people in movements and in third-party movements without that analysis of isms, without that vision as to what can be. And unlike what happened in the 40s, 50s, the 1800s, when their day-to-day is not that in-your-face oppression, and you think and you're operating under the illusion of choice, then you can forget the immediacy of these issues, right? And that's part of where we are now. So after we get other comments, I want to kind of ask you all about what is the mature way of participating in a democracy. We know that it's not just about the two parties. We know that it's not just about the every 4-year or every 2-year votes. What can we do in recognizing all of these things that we have discussed? So you can think about that as we hear from Lawrence. I am going to turn to you first. Thoughts, please.
Hey, glad to be on the call. I have to get off very soon. But I did want to say briefly, it's a lot to take in. But one thing I do think about a lot is I'm just reading this book by a Bantu theorist called Fukuyao. And one thing I realized is that voting every 4 years, there's a different electorate. Many people literally just vote because their grandmother texted them or their auntie texted them and said, you gotta go vote. So a wise person said, find the people's greatest strengths, find their greatest weakness. So if the people that voted in the general every 4 years for president voted in primaries, we probably would see very different politics. And one of the biggest frustrations many people in the Bernie campaign had was this was an attempt for an independent to basically try to push the party left. But the people who vote in primaries are so particular that they couldn't get the people to vote in those primaries. So I think that's a problem I theorize about. I don't have an answer to it, but I do think about also about people who don't vote. And I was having a talk the other day, and for me, a lot of it is you cannot vote in this country as a Black person with self-respect and maintain that self-respect. It's almost impossible. And when you are a Black person who does not expect political benefits, your self-respect and the respect of people in your community as not being a mark is more important than the benefits you think you might get from voting. So I just think of it like a barbershop conversation when people are talking about a politician doing something stupid, which they will do. It's like, well, is that your man's? Is that your woman's? You know, and just that sense of communal affiliation, I can at least keep my self-respect and deny them the credibility of my name being co-signed onto them. So one of the biggest things I think about is that if we are going to develop a third party, just making sure that we're doing the forms of advocacy that the Green Party is doing with Question H, so that people can have something to lean on in that barbershop conversation that says, hey, we delivered this concrete set. And similarly, if we are going to engage the Democratic Party, don't just give them your vote, demand that they give you concrete concessions. So when I was in the room for the Also Brooks campaign, that I was like, look, most of the people I know cannot rock with her because of the Gaza stuff. But if you give people something, people other than me can at least give them something to talk about. And what I gave them was, look, you're going to run on reproductive justice. I can't give nobody a recommendation to vote for her until I get a concrete commitment for something like a birthing center in Baltimore area. We don't have one. If you're a doula, you don't have a place to go. They don't want you in the hospitals. Just a horrible prenatal, perinatal care. Give me a building. Give me something concrete that you can give to the community. And when people say, if that's your woman's in them, you get to say, hey, but didn't your cousin, she had that bad C-section at Hopkins, but she went to the birthing center, it was better for her. They'd be like, oh yeah, true. So these are the sort of vernacular communal politics that we're trying to build into institutional formations to represent. There's no singular answer to it. But I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad to have you here, Lawrence. I want to just see whether MJW, whether Erica, whether Elizabeth have anything that you want to offer.
Hi, this is Elizabeth. I just want to offer my appreciation for what I've been hearing, because I don't have that much experience with third party perspectives, and I really appreciate learning more about that. It seems so important. I would definitely rather we have more than two parties in this country. It doesn't make sense to be stuck where we are. And thank you, everybody, for your contributions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I see MJW with the hand up.
Thank you. I'm a senior to most of you because I'm 76 years old. But I think I can speak for most all of us. In 2008, when Barack Obama got elected, of how overjoyed we felt. And yet, while things got better, they didn't get good enough. And I would suggest that it's not because he was not good enough, but he had to fight the machinery of the party. And it doesn't matter what party. Politicians end up having to compromise because of the political system. And as a result, they don't give us their best. And so we have to go deeper in terms of raising public awareness about what we really can accomplish and what the possibilities are to make any party work. It's not just if we had two more parties, things are automatically going to get better if we take the same consciousness to those parties.
Thank
That's
you
my
so
thinking.
much. Thank you. That is good. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, actually, I was saying that I think Elizabeth was the one that spoke first, and that my feeling was very much along with hers. I'm not a history buff in any way, shape, or form. And I just found the things that you all shared tonight very enlightening, very thought-provoking. Definitely an answer to some tensions that I've been feeling within in terms of satisfaction, dissatisfaction with what I've, been experiencing of late. So I would like to thank you all for this presentation. It's been very enlightening for me.
Awesome. Come back to our next one, because we're going to continue or later in the year with Andy and Nnamdi, probably after the election. You mentioned Barack Obama. Oh, I'm sorry. What?
Well, I just want to say how much I admire your spirit and dedication and commitment. It's heartening to see, especially from our point of view.
Thank you. Well,
Hope for the future.
BRJA has been around doing these 13th of the months for what, 20 years now? And we feel very privileged to be able to provide such a forum for the community and people who really want to have an opportunity to delve deeper onto this and a variety of other subjects, because as we know, racism, classism, ableism, all of the isms impact everything, with race being at the core. I remember when Barack Obama first ran, and I was on a business trip, and I remember being in a room. There were like about 30 of us, and I remember being the only person in the room who, although I was grateful for the symbolism, did not have any of the high hopes, because Barack Obama spent his political career as a centrist. And for me, this gets back to what Nnamdi and Andy were saying, about like the training, the helping people understand that there is more than two-party, that there is a different way of looking at all of these things. Because if we get representation, if what we get are, as Andy said, the Black assimilationists, then we go nowhere, except we get to have great symbolism while we're still dealing with the same old policies. So that's something that we have to continue to think about too. I want to turn back to Andy and Nnamdi to see if you all have anything else to add. I'm conscious of the time, and there's one thing I really want to hear everybody's thoughts on, and that is the role of social media in our campaigns now. But even before we get to that, you all have heard everybody's comments and thoughts. What are you thinking?
I want to say two things here. One is that the ability to leverage the question of in or out is a place where power exists, right? So if we consolidate into an entirely two-party system, there is no power to leverage the question of in and out. So Fannie Lou Hamer, 1964, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, they formed, they ran candidates in the primary, they went to the Democratic Convention and got a bad deal. They came back and they tried to run as independent candidates. And so they were trying to leverage the power of in or out after in wasn't working for them in order to threaten the power structure from the outside. And we have to, if we want to be able to get away from the system we have right now, we have to allow the possibility of people to leverage the power to be in or out of the existing two-party system. Another point that I would say here is in relation to South Carolina that we've talked about a decent amount. So in 1969, in November of 1969, the South Carolina Voter Education Project, which was a Black-led voter education and voter registration project led by James Clyburn, who many of us know was a prominent Democrat, formed they announced an effort to form the Unified Citizens Party of South Carolina, and they did so because despite Black loyalty to the Democratic Party, since Black people have been allowed to vote in South Carolina, there were no Black state legislators existed, and none have been nominated out of Democratic conventions up until 1969. So James Clyburn and a bunch of civil rights organizations and a bunch of Black colleges did a year-long petition drive in order to collect 10,000 signatures in order to be registered and accepted as a political party in South Carolina. They were recognized in 1970, and they were able to elect 3 Black legislators to the South Carolina State House, the first Black folks to be elected to the South Carolina State House since Reconstruction, right? And so Clyburn, whatever we think about where Clyburn is today, he leveraged that in or out question to begin to A, make sure that Black people had political representation in South Carolina, and B, to be able to force a Black agenda, which was about poverty reduction and voting rights, onto the face of South Carolina politics and into the legislature. So if we want to think about places where third parties have broken free, got people elected, and make changes, South Carolina in 1970 may be a really good example of that. And if we want to think about ways that those people sometimes come back in as a result of the power they've gotten, we can see James Clyburn as the old graybeard of the Democratic Party at this point. So, I mean, I think that is the push and pull of this. The in or out is where power lies in relationship to the two parties. And, the ability to say, we're going to try it in, and if that doesn't work, we're going to go out and we're going to build political power that challenges you all, is where the disproportionate power of small parties outside of the two-party system exists.
Thank you. And I think we could do a whole nother 13th of the month on that push-pull, just using James Clyburn as an example of what, of how someone can leverage from the outside and then get in and get all of the perks of being in, and use that power for purposes that maybe aren't most advantageous to community and to the outside power. See how diplomatic I'm trying to be.
Yeah. I know Nnamdi's gonna have a thing to say.
Okay, go Nnamdi, go.
Wait, let me say one thing real quick before I do that. Haynes Walton Jr., who writes a book about the history of Black political parties in the United States, and he wrote this in the 1970s. He says that the question is not about the two-party system. The question is about Black liberation. And so the question is, which political means best allow Black people to leverage the political power they have to work toward liberation? And sometimes that's working within the two-party system, and sometimes that's working without the two-party system. But he says the goal of Black political parties is not to destroy the duopoly, it's Black liberation.
Yes, thank you. Nnamdi?
Yeah, so I do want to address the social media and the democratic right to talk about politics. But a segue. Barack Obama, in his first attempt to run for a federal office, was for a U.S. congressman, I believe in 2000. He ran up against a political force that he could not out-hustle, was an ex-Black Panther in Chicago, Bobby Rush, who was the Minister of Defense to Fred Hampton. Bobby Rush was at that time a congressman who had very, very deep roots in the Black working class community of Chicago. And Barack Obama literally got spanked. I mean, really bad. And the reforming of Obama is very interesting to kind of see how he was developed after that, because he could not out-left a person with a track record on the left. And Bobby Rush is definitely not perfect, but I just wanted to bring that up. So let's talk about social media and the democratic right to freedom of speech.
Before we do it, if I can ask you to hold that, because Brandon has been waiting for a minute. And so I don't want to close out this section without providing him opportunity to share.
Yes, it's more to the question of social media. I think the social media.
Oh, you're going on social media? You're ready to move
I was gonna,
there?
yes, because it's only right to have a comment that contributes to the contributing conversation.
All
So
right,
just,
go for it.
just on the social media aspect, I think it acts as a looking glass for everyone. And the best example, can't speak for people on the call, but I think for many off the call, they probably would agree, is the debate with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, where the media, the corporate and legacy media, made a great mistake. They made a mistake of showing the persons or voters of the two-party system in America that the plane of democracy or the political hegemony, the pilots are all on autopilot, because as a plane needs two pilots, one was asleep and the other just don't know how to fly the plane. So what does that mean for people that were on board? That means that the media and social media had an opportunity to show many of us the things we wanted to see, the things we didn't want to know, the things we didn't want to know, the things we must see, all to say that as functional-minded and able-bodied person, and those who are also have disabilities, that we understand that when we are held captive or your vote is held ransom, social media has that opportunity to show you that this is what you've been supporting for the past umpteen years. These are the leaders, the best that the two parties could produce inside of a plane of political contradiction, and as well as struggles and strife within classisms and ideological struggles. That's all I wanted to say. Just social media acts as a looking glass for everyone.
Thank you. And as Brother Moses says, it is a blessing and a curse. It can cause chaos and confusion as disinformation. And oh, God knows we are seeing that during this season. Nnamdi, thoughts?
Yeah, so I wanted to raise that because I think social media clearly is a powerful weapon, right? It's a powerful weapon for educating, miseducating, for confusing people, for making issues out of things that aren't issues. I think it's really important to also recognize the space that it should provide, right? I think in this time period, I've been very vocal about being an independent and critiquing the Democrat and Republican candidates. I think being able to have a democracy where access to candidates, access to ideas isn't I almost say criminalized, but in a true sense, you can't, even if you say, well, I don't support either one, people's react, well, who are you gonna vote for? Like, dude, I mean, these people have college educations and don't know that there are, independent parties running candidates. There are individuals running as president. You have a host of people you can vote for if you do a little work. And I think the problem with social media, obviously, is it reflects all the historical contradiction we've been talking about: control, power, access. If you can keep control of social media in the hands of the ruling class, of the duopoly, then you can crowd out, push out any legitimate critiques. You can delegitimize, right, real arguments, like the whole the movement around the no vote in the Democratic primaries, where hundreds of thousands of people were more interested in choosing none of the above. I mean, in the state of Maryland, none of the above was the second choice. All the other candidates didn't even combine, right? So, I mean, how do you squash all of these voices? How do you squash a real policy discussion, right, if you are not allowing social media to be equally accessed by all, and I'm talking about responsibly accessed. I'm not just talking about, because we know what we're seeing, right? So I think it's really important for us to deal with that. Social media is not going away, right? I mean, but the truth is, social media is as dominant as radio was in 1930, right? As dominant as newspapers were in its day, as dominant as TV was in the 60s and 70s. I mean, whatever the most dominant form of media is, the truth is that it's always in the hands of the ruling class, of the elite, and they're already in pocket about what side. And sometimes we find that they're double paying both sides. They don't lose no matter what, right? I mean, so we have to recognize that fighting for that space, fighting for that democratic right to be able to express ourselves, to be able to give access to people to new ideas. Because the truth is, sometimes people just need to hear that they have permission to vote for somebody that really represents them, right? Maybe that makes them go to the polls because they wouldn't have went, or they have a much better feeling about what they did after they vote, right? And if people still vote for who they're going to vote for in the Democrat and Republican Party, they can't say they didn't know that they're voting for an imperialist and a fascist. You know, because you've been told.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And- oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
Yes, social media is essential for third parties to be able to break the stranglehold that exists on media. And part of along with the political science, intelligentsia, and establishment clamping down to a two-party system in the 1950s, so did the terrestrial media, so did the big networks, so did all of those folks. So coming out of the post-war period, we had political scientists consolidating a two-party system, and we had media consolidating coverage around only that two-party system. And if we want to break it down, we have to be able to make the associational connections that exist via social media and to get the information that otherwise would not be able to get out there. I'm going to put a clip in the chat that is from Butch Ware, who was Jill Stein's vice president on the Breakfast Club yesterday. There's a lot of really good stuff on this interview, but here is Butch pushing back on the use of Blackness being used to, what he says, support the Palestinian genocide. And he is talking about Thomas Sankara, he's talking about Malcolm X, he's talking about James Baldwin in a way that no traditional media would ever otherwise cover him. Now, people may watch this interview and they may think that they may have their own thoughts about, how Stein and Ware did in this interview and things like that. But this clip of Butch, who is a, trained historian in African history and in Islam, being able to say these things and get the kind of audience that he got is not going to happen 20, 30 years ago. And it is essential to be able to hear those kind of voices on without having to go to an event that UJIMA puts on or LBS puts on or BRJA puts on. It's essential to be able to hear that over a network. The second thing I'll say about it is social media is important, but social networks are even more important. And those social networks may take the form of Twitter, they may take the form of TikTok, but they may take the form of your community group chat, where community folks are getting together and talking about stuff in ways that we never see, because that's the undercurrents of those conversations. But like people, if we want to challenge the two-party system, we have to do it in public on the social media, but we also have to do it within social networks that are invisible and operate within Black communities, white communities, working class communities, because a lot of people are getting their information there, and we have to make sure that we're attuned to that and not just playing for the clicks and the views.
Thank you. So you all have moved to the strategies that of connecting, of organizing, of mobilizing, and these strategies, in order for there to be viable candidates that are outside of the duopoly, all of these strategies have to come into effect even before the year of voting, right? Can you share just a couple of other concrete ideas or thoughts for people to become connected? Andy, you shared the community group chats and the social networking. Are there other thoughts for connecting to organizing or mobilizing efforts that you all want to share?
Yeah, I'll talk about question H, because Nnamdi, Lawrence, and I are all involved in an effort called Baltimore for Democracy. And it is challenging David Smith of Sinclair Broadcasting and the Baltimore Sun's charter amendment that would slash the Baltimore City Council in half, basically in half, from 15 seats to 8 seats. And it is entirely funded by one Republican and entirely an organization run by another Republican. It is not a result of grassroots democratic conversations. It is a result of money and politics being able to shape the form and nature of government in a way that is detrimental to Black people and to working class communities. And we formed this organization because we think there needs to be a thicker democracy. We think there needs to be democratic conversation and democratic participation that doesn't just occur around elections. Otherwise, wealthy people with wealthy and powerful people will use our lax campaign finance laws and easy ballot access laws for things like charter amendments and constitutional amendments to shape government in the way they want. And we are never going to be able to compete with them in terms of their money, their television and propaganda network, their newspaper, and things like that. But we are working, our group is working with individuals who are working alongside unions and advocacy organizations who are working alongside electeds. We may not beat this particular initiative. We need everybody to vote, everybody in Baltimore to vote no on question H. We may not beat this particular initiative, but we know that we can't rely on those Democrats who are elected at City Hall in order to beat these type of things going forward. And we need to develop those democratic muscles inside and outside of election seasons so that the next time a billionaire decides he wants to, a billionaire and his family decide that they want to radically restructure the nature of our city, we are ready and we have had the conversations, we're embedded in the social networks, and we're able to reach out to people. So I think that's an example of the kind of organizing we need to be doing around the clock, not just at election season. We need to be making sure that people are aware that there's thicker democracy, that there are more participation, and that we're engaging people on questions that relate to their lived experience in their material life every day, so that when it comes time for elections, we don't have to scramble to mobilize them in order to stop a real threat. They're already ready to go.
Thank you. Nnamdi?
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Hopefully, if you see yourself as an independent or at least someone who supports it, you're better able to have that discussion about politics and not just the duopoly, right? I think for us, the question, especially for democratic participation, it's about building relationships for people and having people connected to their real struggles, right? We talk about politics now because obviously you have this really hotly debated, it's almost like a program, right? Like watching a series, right? Of this national presidency. But the truth is that the politics that most people are impacted by happens at the local level. It happens at the state level. It is an equalizer, to be honest, because smaller election camp means smaller budgets. You're able to have conversations with people. I think we have to build networks around resistance and around democratic rights and around what makes changes for people in the real world, and put that up against the kind of solutions that aren't working, right? For working and poor people in the city and around the state. I think also education is going to be so key, right? Civics has been taken out of most schools. People are dumbed down by Fox and by CNN. We have to be able to speak to people, elevate their political understanding, make them more conscious of what their own interests are so that they're equipped, right, to be able to jump in, to know that I can't just wait for a politician that I voted for, but I can also activate that person. I can have a say about what that person is going to do, or I can do something about getting that person out of office, right? Should they not be the kind of representation we want. So I think this is only the beginning. This election season is going to be interesting. I'm telling people no matter who wins, we should be better organized. Neither one is offering answers to working class people. Neither one of them are offering answers to the ending genocide and bringing peace to this world. Those things we're going to have to do independently of the duopoly either way.
Nnamdi, Lumumba, Andy, Ellis, thank you both for once again offering your wisdom on these issues. And for those of you who've joined us today, thank you for being a part of this social networking, this community, this forum in which we can all connect and begin to discuss organizing and begin to discuss mobilizing. We will be back with Nnamdi and with Andy if they agree after the election, so that we can talk more about this topic and about how we all continue to be involved and grow in our involvement during this time that is outside of voting season and outside of the duopoly. Thank you all. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dana to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Adar. Yeah, so just to repeat, thank you, Nnamdi. Thank you, Andy, so much. And Adar, thank you, because you were a moderator and more than a moderator, really a discussant as well. I want to share a couple opportunities for folks to connect with BRJA and each other. These are some resources that we'll be sharing. Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, for white folks, we are doing a series of workshops for white people this fall. The first one, Practical Anti-Racism Learning, is already about halfway through. But if folks viewing on YouTube are interested, we have one in October and one in November. And these are on our socials, and you can get much more information that way. Yes, and the promised reunion of this group is going to be in November. So looking forward from the 2024 election, that event will be in person at the Southeast Anchor branch of the Enoch Pratt Library. And then meanwhile, we have a wonderful event in October that's going to be virtual and is going to be a follow-up of a discussion we had earlier this year. And it's obviously who is Black, African Americans, Black immigrants, and racial identity in the US. That's going to be playing on the many conversations going around Kamala Harris's racial identity. So we invite you to join us for those two events. And then a couple more thoughts. Yeah, we talked a bit about lack of resources and scarcity earlier in the conversation. And BRJA is a very small organization, and we very much appreciate your financial support if you can throw a little money our way. So yeah, through our website or through this QR code, we appreciate any amount very deeply. And then I believe lastly, other opportunities for connecting. If you would like to be on our mailing list, you can put your email address in the chat. We are on all the socials, not all the socials. We're not so much on Twitter. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and we have a YouTube channel with all of these events that go on there. And then last but not least, we will be introducing a new website at the beginning of October that we're very excited about. And with that, I believe I'm going to say goodnight to everybody. So thank you all for attending. And again, panel, thank you all.